Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving deep into a really fascinating and honestly profound topic.
We are. It's all about the hidden impact of maternal stress during pregnancy.
Right, how it affects a child's entire life. We're
Yeah.
talking about the womb environment shaping everything from, a baby's temperament right through to adult mental health decades later.
Yeah, it's a journey into this thing called the fetal origins hypothesis.
And that concept, it really sort of redefines how we think about nature versus nurture, doesn't it?
Completely. Our mission here is to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight. We've got a stack of incredible sources.
Cutting-edge academic research, public health guides, some pretty surprising epidemiological studies, too.
And you'll hear about real-world events, things like natural disasters, historical famines, and how they actually helped illuminate this hidden connection.
We'll dig into the how
Biological mechanisms involved, yeah.
and the why, those surprising evolutionary reasons behind these changes.
Crucially, we'll also talk about what this all means for you. We want to offer practical insights, highlight where support and intervention can, make a real difference.
So get ready for some serious aha moments. Okay, to start, when we talk about fetal origins, what exactly is the big idea here? What are we grappling with?
Well, at its core, the fetal origins hypothesis proposes that gestation, that time a baby spends developing in the womb, it significantly impacts an individual's health and well-being from infancy, like all the way into adulthood.
It's foundational then, saying that early environment sets a lifelong trajectory.
Precisely.
And these impacts, they aren't always immediate, are they? What sort of defines how these fetal effects show up? And do they stick around?
That's a really crucial point. There are three key characteristics we look for. First, there's latency.
Latency.
Meaning
Yeah.
the effects might not even appear until much, much later in life. Think of it like a delayed action blueprint. Second, there's persistency. So the conditions that result from some fetal experience, they can continue for that person throughout their life. Right. And third, and this is what's truly remarkable, is genetic programming.
Genetic programming.
Oh.
Yeah. This describes how the prenatal environment can actually, switch on or switch off specific genes.
Well,
It alters their expression without changing the underlying DNA sequence itself. Epigenetics, basically.
that's a huge shift in understanding because, for a long time, the belief was that the fetus was almost immune, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Immune to harmful environmental factors from the mother.
Like the placenta was this perfect, impenetrable shield.
Exactly. And that mindset, well, it led to some tragic consequences. For instance, back in the early to mid-20th century, some pregnant women consumed alcohol or took medications with very little societal concern.
Right.
But this changed dramatically. Discoveries like thalidomide in the 1960s.
Oh, yeah. Terrible birth defects. Severe birth defects, brain damage, missing limbs. Then came diethylstilbestrol, DES, in 71. Shockingly linked to a rare vaginal cancer in daughters, years later.
Years later. Wow. That latency again.
Exactly. And then the official recognition of fetal alcohol syndrome in 1973. That really underscored alcohol's profound, lasting impact.
These were like sobering revelations. They completely redefined our understanding of the womb environment.
They really did. A scientific awakening, as you put it.
And did these discoveries sort of pave the way for new theories? I'm thinking about David Barker's work, the epidemiologist.
They certainly did, David Barker, yeah. In 1986, he was one of the first to really link prenatal nutrition directly to adult diseases.
Like heart disease.
Like coronary heart disease, yes. He observed higher heart disease rates in the poorest areas of England, and it correlated strikingly with low birth weight. Now, his ideas were initially met with, well, quite a bit of skepticism.
I bet.
But his findings have since been replicated globally. Though it's important to say, with some important nuances, it's not always straightforward.
And he had this really vivid way of explaining it, didn't he? The postcards analogy.
Yes. Barker's idea was, well, brilliant in its simplicity. He proposed that fetuses get these postcards from the placenta.
Clues about the outside world.
Essentially, yeah. Clues about the outside world, preparing their physiology for what's coming. It's an adaptive mechanism, you see.
Makes sense.
If the expected environment matches reality, great. The child is well prepared. But, and here's the crucial part, if there's a mismatch, say the fetus is programmed for scarcity, like not much food around, but is then born into abundance.
Then those adaptations become harmful.
Exactly. They can become harmful maladaptive.
Which leads straight into the thrifty phenotype hypothesis, doesn't it?
It does.
That idea that if a fetus experiences limited nutrition, gets programmed for scarcity, and then is born into an environment where nutrition improves, maybe too much.
Then there's an increased risk of metabolic disorders, like type 2 diabetes.
So an adaptation meant to help them survive scarcity actually backfires in an environment of plenty.
Precisely. And this is particularly relevant, for communities maybe grappling with poverty, where maternal malnutrition might program a fetus for sparse conditions.
Right.
Then later, these individuals encounter readily available, often highly processed foods, and their metabolisms are just not efficient for that. It can lead to obesity, type 2 diabetes.
It's a powerful example of early programming having these really long-term unintended consequences.
It really is.
And I remember reading about a study, I think, from Harvard Medical School and the American Journal of Epidemiology. They actually set out to disprove Barker's hypothesis.
Ah, yes, that study. It's a great example of science sort of testing itself.
So what do they find? How does that fit in?
Well, initially, they did confirm a strong link between low birth weight and later coronary heart disease and stroke.
Okay, so supporting Barker.
Initially, yes. But then, later analysis, when they controlled for more confounding factors, things that could also explain the link, they found no statistically significant direct association between low birth weight, as a proxy for that intrauterine nutrition, and later cardiovascular disease risk compared to normal birth weight.
So it muddied the waters a bit.
It showed the complexity. What it tells us is that while Barker's work was absolutely groundbreaking, hugely influential, the field is complex. There are many variables. It's not always a simple one-to-one correlation.
Right. Research continues to refine things.
Exactly. It's an ongoing discussion.
Okay, so we've got the foundational concepts of the fetal origins hypothesis down. Let's pivot now to the really compelling evidence. What does the research actually show happens after prenatal stress? Specifically thinking about neonatal and birth outcomes first.
Right. Well, studies reliably link maternal reports of daily hassles, depression, anxiety.
Just everyday stuff, not necessarily major trauma.
Exactly. Even those things are linked to earlier delivery and smaller size at birth.
And those aren't just minor blips, are they?
No, they're risk factors themselves. Risk factors for impaired cognitive and social development later on. Imagine that even the everyday stresses a mother navigates, like persistent worries or mild anxiety, can subtly yet measurably influence when her baby arrives and their size. It really underscores how even seemingly minor stressors can ripple through development.
What really seems to crystallize this are those striking real-world examples like the Northridge earthquake in California, 94.
Oh, absolutely. That 6.8 magnitude quake, it led to approximately 1 week earlier delivery for pregnant women.
Especially those exposed early on, right? First trimester.
That's right. A direct, measurable impact from an acute, sudden event.
And then, tragically, September 11th in New York City.
Yes. Following 9/11, while women near the World Trade Center didn't generally have shorter pregnancies, their infants were nearly twice as likely to experience intrauterine growth restriction. IUGR.
Meaning birth weights below the 10th percentile.
Exactly. The body's response to that extreme stress, it's clearly profound and can manifest in different ways.
And it's not just these massive catastrophic events, is it? You mentioned daily hassles.
Right. More consistent results actually come from studies looking at those daily hassles, negative life events, even occupational stressors.
Like stress at work.
Yeah. These show an increased risk of preterm birth, for example. One study showed a 1.8 times increased risk for birth between 24 and 29 weeks.
Wow.
And about a 1.8 times increased risk for low birth weight. So that chronic lower-level stress, it definitely adds up.
Beyond just the size and timing of birth, does prenatal stress show up in the newborn's behavior or neurology?
It does. It's associated with lower scores on neonatal neurobehavioral assessments. And intriguingly, newborns of highly anxious mothers showed a distinct pattern.
What was that?
Greater right frontal brain activation. Now, this isn't just a neurological quirk.
No.
It's a signature in the brain that researchers link to a predisposition towards negative emotions, increased anxiety later in life.
So it's like their emotional thermostat is set differently right from birth.
That's a good way to put it. These infants also spent more time in deep sleep and performed less optimally on things like the Neonatal Behavioral Assessment Scale, the NBAS.
And it's not just general stress, but pregnancy-specific worries too, like about the baby's health or becoming a parent.
Yes, that pregnancy-specific distress, worries about screenings, infant health, the idea of motherhood itself, that also increases the risk for preterm birth and shorter gestational age.
Okay, so moving beyond those immediate birth outcomes, prenatal stress clearly has long-term effects too. Infancy, childhood, even adulthood.
Absolutely. Let's look at social and emotional outcomes first.
This is where it gets really compelling, I think.
It is. Studies show that infants whose mothers had higher depression and anxiety scores in the third trimester.
And crucially, you said these scores often weren't even in the clinical range, right? Just higher levels of stress.
That's right. Not necessarily a diagnosed disorder. But their infants displayed higher levels of negative affect, more fussiness, crying, and more motor activity when they were shown novel toys at 4 months old.
And that specific behavioral profile
Is linked to shyness and anxiety disorders later in childhood. And importantly, the mother's postnatal mood wasn't linked to these specific infant behaviors in some studies.
pointing directly back to the prenatal period.
Exactly. It really isolates that prenatal influence.
And what about ADHD? Is there a link there?
That's perhaps one of the most striking and consistent findings, a clear connection between prenatal stress and the development of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, symptoms.
Seen across a wide age range?
Yeah, from 4 up to 15 years old in various studies. We also consistently see increased anxiety symptoms and what we call externalizing problems like aggression or defiance in these children. Even in animal models, non-human primates exposed to prenatal stress consistently show attention deficits.
It really shifts how you think about the origins, the very roots of conditions like ADHD.
It absolutely does.
That's profound. Okay, what about cognitive outcomes? Does prenatal stress affect things like learning, intelligence?
Yes, the research shows effects there too on things like the Bailey Mental Development Index scores, MDI scores.
That's a standard infant development test.
Right. Also effects on language development and even later school grades.
Wow. Any specific examples?
A really striking one comes from that 1998 ice storm in Quebec. Remember that? Left some regions without power or water for weeks.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that study.
Children whose mothers were pregnant during that event showed lower MDI and language development scores later on.
And it wasn't just the objective hardship, was it?
No. What's fascinating is that the maternal subjective distress, how stressed the mother felt during the storm, uniquely predicted 11 to 12% of the variance in those scores, even after controlling for other factors.
So her perception of the stress mattered just as much, maybe more, than the event itself.
It tells us perception is key. Now, what's particularly interesting and maybe a bit counterintuitive is one study actually found a small but significant positive association between small to moderate levels of antenatal stress and better MDI and physical development index scores.
Better, so a little stress might be good.
The researcher suggested it might indicate a kind of U-shaped curve, where maybe a little bit of stress could actually be beneficial, perhaps giving the developing organs a sort of workout before birth.
Fascinating. So the relationship isn't always linear. Too little stress might not be optimal. Too much is bad.
Exactly. It highlights the complexity. It's not just stress is bad.
Okay. Beyond social, emotional, cognitive,
Right.
are there other effects, like on laterality-handedness or other neurodevelopmental disorders?
Yes, there are links there too. For instance, antenatal anxiety is linked to an increased likelihood of mixed-handedness in children, not being strongly right or left-handed.
Interesting. And autism. I think I saw a recent study on that.
Yes, a recent study showed prenatal stress, particularly stress experienced between 25 and 28 weeks of gestation, seems to be associated with an increased risk of autism.
These are such complex neurodevelopmental conditions.
Yeah.
Connecting them to the prenatal environment is a huge piece of the puzzle.
It really is. And these disorders, autism, ADHD, maybe even mixed-handedness, they often share some underlying neurodevelopmental components.
And antenatal maternal stress might exacerbate that vulnerability.
It suggests a potential shared pathway, yes.
Hmm.
A way that early stress might nudge development towards these outcomes in susceptible individuals.
And this long shadow, it stretches right into adulthood, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Specifically regarding psychopathology, mental illness.
It does. Maternal exposure to really traumatic events during pregnancy is linked to an increased lifetime risk of psychiatric disorders for the offspring.
You mentioned historical examples earlier.
Right. Offspring of women who were pregnant during the 1940 German invasion of the Netherlands had a significantly increased risk of developing schizophrenia later in life. The odds ratio was about 1.5.
So 50% higher risk.
Essentially, yes. Similar findings, an odds ratio of 1.8, were seen after a major flood in the Netherlands in 1953.
These historical events, they're like tragic natural experiments, aren't they? Providing incredibly strong evidence.
They really are. And a higher incidence of affective disorders, so things like depression or bipolar disorder, was seen in Chinese adults whose mothers were pregnant during a severe earthquake back in 1976.
The echoes of a single traumatic event stretching across generations.
Clearly. And even more specifically, drilling down biologically. Children of women who developed PTSD from the 9/11 attacks,
Yeah.
they were found to have lower basal cortisol levels years later, mirroring their mother's HPA axis dysregulation.
Lower cortisol. I thought stress meant higher cortisol.
It often does acutely, but chronic stress or the aftermath of trauma like PTSD can sometimes lead to this burnout effect, resulting in lower baseline cortisol. And this effect in the children was strongest for those whose mothers were exposed in the third trimester.
Suggesting an in utero vulnerability to stress that manifests biologically in their own stress response system years down the line.
Exactly, a biological echo of the mother's trauma.
Okay, so we've really explored the profound what and what happens.
Yeah.
Now let's tackle the crucial question: how? What are the biological mechanisms actually linking maternal stress to these outcomes in children? What's going on under the hood?
Right. The primary biological mechanism that's been studied the most is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis.
The body's main stress response system.
Exactly. It's critical for adapting to stress, mobilizing energy, keeping inflammation in check. Maternal stress obviously alters her hormonal profile, her cortisol levels.
All right.
And there's a strong correlation between maternal and fetal cortisol levels. Although, interestingly, fetal levels are about 10 times lower than the mother's.
10 times lower. But still, enough crosses the placenta to potentially affect fetal brain development.
That's the thinking, yes. Enough seems to get through.
But this raises an important question, doesn't it? I know the placenta has an enzyme, 11-beta-HSD2.
That's the one.
And its job is basically to break down maternal cortisol, acting as a barrier to limit fetal exposure.
Correct. It deactivates cortisol into cortisone.
Plus, I read that maternal cortisol responses to stress actually decline significantly across pregnancy. They become quite blunted by late gestation.
That's also true. The system becomes less reactive.
So if the effects we're seeing happen earlier in pregnancy, before that HPA axis dampening really kicks in, or if the enzyme barrier isn't perfect, how are researchers reconciling this? It seems like there's still a bit of a puzzle about the precise timing and mechanism, especially via cortisol.
You're absolutely right. It's a key area of active research and debate. And this is where epigenetics becomes so incredibly important.
The gene switching.
Exactly. Epigenetics helps fill some of those gaps. It refers to changes in gene expression without altering the DNA sequence itself. Think of methylation, for example.
Like a chemical tag on the DNA.
Precisely, like a dimmer switch on a gene. Now, when prenatal stress increases methylation on a really crucial gene, the glucocorticoid receptor gene, or GR gene, particularly in the hippocampus, a key brain area for stress regulation. It effectively dims that gene, blocks its transcription. This leads to fewer of these stress-regulating GR receptors being made.
And the consequence of having fewer receptors.
The child's HPA axis, their stress response system, has less negative feedback control. It becomes much more sensitive, more prone to overreacting to stressors later in life. It's like the mother's stress experience has rewired the child's ability to cope with stress.
For life. Wow, so the mother's stress physically reprograms how the child's stress system works. It's like a lasting cellular memory.
That's a great way to think about it. And even diet can interact with this.
How so?
Well, low-protein maternal diet, for example, can actually decrease the activity of that protective 11-BHSD2 enzyme in the placenta.
Meaning more maternal cortisol could get through to the fetus.
Potentially, yes. And nutrients like methionine, which comes from protein and is a methyl donor needed for those epigenetic methylation tags. The availability of methionine might alter how perinatal stress affects gene expression. It shows just how interconnected diet, stress, and epigenetics are.
Fascinating. Are there other mechanisms beyond the HPA axis and epigenetics that researchers are looking at?
Oh, definitely. Inflammatory activity is another big one.
Inflammation.
Yeah. Prenatal stress activates the mother's immune system. Increasing inflammatory cytokines, things like interleukin-6, tumor necrosis factor alpha,
And those are linked too.
they're consistently linked to preterm birth and low birth weight. In fact, women who go into preterm labor often have elevated inflammatory markers in their system.
So stress triggers inflammation. Inflammation triggers preterm birth,
Okay.
potentially.
That's one strong hypothesis, yes. Another potential pathway is the sympathetic adrenal system.
Our fight or flight response. Adrenaline, noradrenaline.
Right. Now, noradrenaline itself doesn't readily cross the placenta,
Okay.
but the mother's fight or flight response could still affect the fetus indirectly, maybe by causing uterine contractions or reducing blood flow to the uterus and placenta. Plus, we see very rapid changes in fetal heart rate that seem linked to the mother's emotional state. That suggests there's some really quick mechanisms at play, likely faster than the relatively slower hormonal changes of the HPA axis.
So multiple interconnected pathways potentially involved.
Almost certainly, it's rarely just one thing in biology.
Okay, so we've covered the what the outcomes and the how, the biological mechanisms.
Mm.
Now let's tackle the why. What's the evolutionary significance here? Why would a fetus adapt in ways that could later become problematic? Seems counterintuitive.
Right. This brings us to the concept of the predictive adaptive response, or PAR.
Predictive adaptive response.
Yeah, the idea is that these early life changes in development aren't necessarily damage. They might actually increase the survival chances for that individual in a changing environment.
So the fetus is making an educated guess.
That's a great way to put it. It's making an educated guess about the world it's about to enter, based on the postcards it gets from the mother. And these developmental changes can happen much faster than waiting for natural selection based on genetic variation over generations.
You mentioned an analogy earlier with snowshoe hares. That really illustrates this well.
It's a fantastic example from the natural world. When food is scarce for snowshoe hares, the stressed pregnant females have high cortisol levels.
Okay.
This high cortisol actually alters the HPA axis development of their offspring,
Making them.
making them more vigilant, more hyper-aware of predators. The stress response is tuned higher.
And in that harsh, high predator environment where food is scarce?
That extra vigilance helps them survive. It's a perfect adaptive mechanism for that specific dangerous world until conditions improve.
Okay, so connecting that back to us, what does this all mean for humans? That extra vigilance, maybe the rapid shifts in attention we see linked to prenatal stress.
Those traits, which were potentially adaptive in a dangerous evolutionary past with predators and fluctuating resources,
Can become maladaptive in modern civilization.
exactly. When you're not constantly facing life or death threats, that heightens stress response, the tendency towards anxiety or difficulty focusing, it can become problematic. Unnecessary anxiety, attention problems, things that were once potentially survival traits.
It's a striking mismatch, isn't it, between our ancient biological programming and our modern world.
A profound mismatch, yes.
Now, when we look at the actual size or magnitude of these effects from prenatal stress, how significant are they?
Well, they can be, as the researchers put it, considerable. For
Yeah.
example, in one study, maternal anxiety during pregnancy accounted for 22% of the variance in ADHD symptoms in 8 to 9-year-old.
22%, that's huge.
It's a very significant proportion. Another study found that stressful life events during pregnancy doubled the risk for ADHD problems later on. So this isn't just a small ripple, it can be a significant wave.
And for cognitive and motor development.
Prenatal stress can account for anywhere from, say, 3 to 8% of the variance in mental and motor development scores, and maybe between 11 and 17% in cognitive and language abilities in some studies, like the Quebec ice storm example.
These are statistically significant impacts on really fundamental aspects of a child's development.
Absolutely. And one estimate suggests that the attributable load, basically, the proportion of emotional or behavioral problems in kids that could potentially be traced back to antenatal anxiety in their mothers, is around 15%.
15%. That's a substantial public health
It
consideration.
really is. However, and this is crucial, there's considerable variation.
Right. It doesn't affect everyone the same way.
Not at all. Prenatal stress does not affect all children equally. It's very likely there are important gene-environment interactions going on.
Meaning the effects might be much more apparent in children who already have certain genetic vulnerabilities.
Precisely. It's almost never just one factor acting in isolation. It's the interplay between the environment and the individual's predispositions.
Okay, this all sounds like incredibly powerful evidence for this fetal programming idea. But The tricky part must be differentiating true prenatal effects from other things, right?
That's the million-dollar question for researchers in this field.
Like, how do you separate it from shared genetics between mother and child? Or from the effects of continuing postnatal stress? A mother who is stressed during pregnancy might well remain stressed after birth, and that could affect her parenting, which then affects the child.
Exactly. Untangling those complex variables is a critical challenge.
So how do they do it? What gives us confidence it really is the prenatal environment?
Well, the strongest evidence for specific prenatal programming comes from studies that are designed very carefully to control for those other factors.
How?
For example, they might statistically control for the mother's postnatal anxiety or depression levels, or they might specifically compare the impact of life events that happened during pregnancy versus those that happened after birth.
Oh, yeah?
And these more robust studies often find that the prenatal stress alone is still associated with the developmental outcomes, even when you account for genetics or the postnatal environment. That allows us to more confidently pinpoint the specific impact of what happened in the womb.
Makes sense. Even with all this incredible research, though, I imagine there are still plenty of remaining questions. Areas for future exploration. The science is always evolving.
Oh, definitely. There's still so much to learn. For example, we need more research on the specific types of antenatal emotional disturbance that might be most harmful.
It's not all the same stress.
Probably not. Some evidence, for instance, points towards marital discord and, sadly, cruelty by partner having particularly strong links to lower cognitive development in children. The source and nature of the stress likely matters a great deal.
And what about differences between boys and girls? Is it clear if stress affects them differently in utero?
That's still pretty unclear. Initially, some studies suggested a greater effect on ADHD symptoms in boys. But other research indicates this risk might actually equalize by around age 7. And remember those fetal death-sex ratios after 9/11, there was an increase in male fetal deaths observed.
Right. Suggesting males might be more vulnerable in some ways.
Potentially, yes. These gender differences definitely warrant further dedicated study.
Another area seems to be timing. Is there agreement on when during pregnancy stress is most impactful?
Not really, no. There's currently little consensus on the most sensitive gestational age. Different studies point to different trimesters, first, second, third, being critical for different outcomes. Nailing down those sensitive periods is really important for thinking about interventions.
And the research base itself, mostly Western countries.
By and large, yes, the vast majority of studies are from Europe and North America. We desperately need more research on women experiencing the harsher everyday stresses common in many developing countries or in active war and conflict zones. The baseline levels of chronic stress there can be significantly higher, and the context is totally different.
Absolutely. What else?
Well, we need a much deeper understanding of those genetic and other vulnerability factors we talked about. Why does one child seem resilient while another is more affected?
And the flip side, protective factors.
Exactly. What protects children? What are the mechanisms of resilience? How do positive prenatal and postnatal environments buffer against stress? We focus a lot on risk, but understanding resilience is just as crucial.
And interventions.
Exploring the potential efficacy of different interventions to actually reduce stress and anxiety during pregnancy is absolutely key. And new approaches, maybe using things like MRI scans, could potentially show the effects of prenatal stress on the developing brain, and maybe even demonstrate if interventions are working by showing positive changes.
Visualizing the impact.
Potentially. And finally, the potential moderating role of maternal diet and immune status needs much more study. How do nutrition and inflammation interact with stress?
So, a lot still to uncover. But given everything we have discussed, this really intricate, profound connection between eternal stress and a child's lifelong path, what are the big implications? And maybe most importantly, what can you, our listener, actually do with this powerful knowledge?
Well, I think the number one implication is crystal clear. Intervening to reduce stress during pregnancy could significantly reduce emotional and cognitive problems in children down the road.
It's not just a research finding. It sounds like a call to action.
It really is.
So on an individual level, if you are pregnant or planning to be, and you're experiencing significant stress, anxiety, or depression, what's the first step?
Talk to your healthcare provider, your doctor, your midwife. Mental health conditions are common during pregnancy, and crucially, they're treatable.
There's no need to just tough it out or suffer in silence.
Absolutely not. Seeking help is an act of profound care, really, for both yourself and your developing baby.
And what about practical coping strategies?
Utilizing relaxation techniques can be incredibly helpful. Things like prenatal yoga, meditation, simple breathing exercises, whatever works for you.
Building support systems, too.
Hugely important. Building a strong social support network, partners, family, friends, maybe support groups. Connection and community are powerful buffers against stress. Don't underestimate that.
And the basics, of course. Maintaining a healthy lifestyle.
Eating well, getting enough sleep, getting some gentle exercise if your provider says it's okay. All those things support overall well-being.
Taking childbirth education classes could also help, right? Preparing for labor and parenthood, reducing anxiety about the unknown.
Definitely. Knowledge is power, and preparation can build confidence and reduce fear.
Now, thinking about our listeners in their professional lives, workplace support is relevant here too, isn't it? Especially in the U.S.
Yes, very relevant. Under the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, the PWFA, if your employer has 15 or more employees, you actually have a legal right to request and receive reasonable accommodations for pregnancy-related conditions, and that explicitly includes mental health issues like anxiety or depression linked to pregnancy.
So what kind of accommodations could that mean?
It could be things like requesting some time off for therapy appointments, maybe temporarily moving your workstation to a quieter, more private space if needed, potentially telecommuting options, or getting a modified work schedule, practical adjustments.
And your employer might ask for a medical note.
They might, yes, but it doesn't necessarily need to state a specific diagnosis, and importantly, federal law requires them to keep that medical information confidential.
Good to know. And the Family and Medical Leave Act, FMLA, might also apply.
Yes, FMLA could also provide up to 12 weeks of leave, potentially, depending on the circumstances and eligibility. So knowing your rights in the workplace can make a real difference in managing stress during this time.
Okay, zooming out to the broader societal and policy level, what are the implications there?
Well, it really underscores the importance of addressing poverty and nutritional needs for pregnant women. Programs like the Federal Food Stamp Program, SNAP, or the Supplemental Feeding Program for Women, Infants, and Children, WIC.
These aren't just about food, are they? They're about long-term health investment.
Absolutely. They directly support maternal and fetal well-being in ways that have lasting consequences.
It also brings health disparities into sharp focus, doesn't it?
It really does. We know that chronic stress, often stemming from societal factors like systemic racism and discrimination, disproportionately affects women from minority groups.
And that chronic stress is linked to higher rates of low birth weight and preterm birth in those communities.
Exactly. It's crucial to understand it's the chronic stress caused by living in challenging, often inequitable environments that's the factor here, not race itself. This highlights the urgent need for systemic solutions that address those root causes of stress and inequality.
And finally, it all points towards prioritizing maternal mental health within the healthcare system itself.
Fundamentally, as one expert we read put it so well, when you work with a pregnant woman, you have two patients, not just one.
Supporting her mental health is an investment in both mother and child.
Precisely.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive has really shown us just how profoundly those 9 months before birth can shape the rest of our lives. It's incredible.
It really is. From historical pandemics and disasters to the anxieties of daily life, the maternal experience echoes through generations. It influences brain development, how we respond to stress, even our susceptibility to certain diseases.
But the story isn't just about vulnerability, is it? It's also about opportunity.
Exactly. We've learned that the developing brain is remarkably plastic, malleable, and even after prenatal challenges, the postnatal environment, things like strong social support, responsive caregiving, timely interventions can offer powerful pathways to resilience and healthy development.
The story doesn't end at birth.
Not at all. There's immense potential for positive influence afterwards.
Which really raises a final important question for everyone listening. If we know that supporting maternal well-being during pregnancy isn't just about the mother's health in that moment,
but it's actually a powerful investment in the future health, the cognitive abilities, the emotional stability of entire generations to come,
then how much more should society be prioritizing and, crucially, resourcing comprehensive mental health and social support for all pregnant individuals?
It's a provocative thought, isn't it? Something for you to mull over, perhaps explore on your own. What would that truly look like?